Welcome to a deep dive on Afghanistan. Today we're tackling this question that has puzzled people for centuries. Why is Afghanistan called the graveyard of empires?
It's a dramatic nickname, but it's pretty accurate historically. From Alexander the Great to the British Empire, the Soviets and now the U.S. global powers have always been drawn to Afghanistan, but only to face these huge challenges and often defeat.
So our deep dive today uses sources you provided to help us understand what makes this landlocked nation so important strategically. Is it purely about location? What role do these natural resources play? And most importantly, what does all this mean for the Afghan people?
Those are excellent questions. And to really understand these answers, we have to start with geography. Afghanistan is often called the heart of Asia, and its location is key to understanding its history.
Okay, so it's right smack dab in the middle of everything. But what does that actually mean in terms of geopolitics?
Well, for centuries, Afghanistan was a crucial hub on the Silk Road. You know, that network of trade routes connecting East and West?
Right.
Its location made it this bridge for the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures between Europe, Asia, and the Middle East.
Makes sense. If you're moving goods across continents, you got to go through Afghanistan. But how has that historical role changed in the modern era?
Today, instead of a bridge, it's more of a strategic choke point. Control over Afghanistan potentially means control over access to Central Asia's vast energy resources, oil and gas. It also impacts China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to connect Asia with Europe and Africa through infrastructure projects.
So whoever controls Afghanistan has a huge advantage in terms of resources and trade. It's no wonder everyone's interested.
Yeah.
But I'm also curious about the graveyard of empires thing. Why have so many powerful nations failed in Afghanistan?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Afghanistan's geography is challenging, to say the least. Rugged mountains, vast deserts, and a lack of infrastructure make it really difficult to control. Then there's the fierce independence of the Afghan people. They have a long history of resisting foreign interference, often through guerrilla warfare tactics.
So it's not just about who has the most powerful army, but also about understanding these local dynamics and winning over the hearts and minds of the people. Sounds like a nearly impossible task for outsiders.
Exactly. And the complex ethnic and tribal dynamics within Afghanistan also play a role. Creating a unified and stable government in such a diverse and often fractured society has proven to be a daunting task, even for Afghans themselves.
Okay, so we've got a geographically challenging location, fiercely independent people, and a complex social fabric. It's starting to become clear why Afghanistan has been such a tough nut to crack for empires throughout history.
Absolutely. But there's another layer to this story that we haven't touched on yet. The vast mineral wealth that lies beneath Afghanistan's surface.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about this. We're talking trillions of dollars worth of untapped resources. Right.
That's right. Estimates vary, but some experts believe Afghanistan's mineral wealth could be worth between $1 and $3 trillion. We're talking about everything from lithium, which is essential for electric car batteries, to rare earth metals, which are crucial for high-tech applications, to more traditional resources like copper, iron, and gold.
Wow, that's incredible. So Afghanistan is sitting on a potential gold mine, yet it's been ravaged by war and poverty for decades. It seems almost unfair.
It is a classic example of what economists call the resource curse. Countries with an abundance of natural resources often struggle to develop stable and equitable economies. In Afghanistan's case, the ongoing conflict, corruption, and lack of infrastructure have prevented the country from benefiting from its own wealth.
So instead of lifting the country out of poverty, these resources have become another source of conflict and instability? That's heartbreaking.
Unfortunately, yes. The potential for wealth has attracted foreign powers looking to exploit these resources for their own gain, often with little regard for the well-being of the Afghan people.
And I'm guessing this brings us to the recent interest from China. They've been making deals with the Taliban to mine lithium, right?
You bet. China is looking to secure its supply chains for the burgeoning electric vehicle industry, and Afghanistan's vast lithium reserves are a tempting target. But China's involvement raises a whole host of new questions and challenges.
So even with the U.S. withdrawal, Afghanistan is still very much at the center of global power struggles. It's like the great game never really ended, just the players changed a bit.
Precisely. And with the Taliban back in power, the stakes are even higher. The future of Afghanistan and its role in the region is more uncertain than ever. But before we delve into those complexities, let's shift our focus to the people most affected by these geopolitical games, the Afghans themselves.
Yes, absolutely. We can't lose sight of the human cost of all this. What are the impacts of this resource curse? the ongoing conflict, and the Taliban's return to power on the lives of ordinary Afghans. It's easy to get caught up in all this geopolitical maneuvering, but we can't forget about the human side of all this. What are the impacts of all this conflict and this uncertainty on the people of Afghanistan?
The humanitarian situation is dire. Decades of war have left the country's infrastructure in ruins. Healthcare and education systems are really struggling to function. Millions of Afghans are internally displaced, and even more are facing food insecurity and poverty.
Yeah, it's truly heartbreaking to think about what they've been through.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the issue of human rights, particularly for women and girls under Taliban rule.
That's a major concern. The Taliban have imposed these severe restrictions on women's lives. Girls are banned from attending secondary school, and women are barred from most forms of employment and public life. It's a devastating setback for women's rights and for Afghan society as a whole.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to turn back the clock to a time when women had no agency or voice. I can't imagine how frustrating and disheartening that must be for Afghan women who are making progress, in education and careers before the Taliban takeover.
It's a huge loss, not just for women, but for the entire country. When you exclude half of the population from participating in society, you're essentially cutting off a vital source of talent, creativity, and innovation.
It seems incredibly short-sighted on the Taliban's part. But how are they justifying these policies? I know they claim to be acting in accordance with their interpretation of Islamic law, but is that the whole story?
It's a complex issue. Some analysts believe that the Taliban's hardline stance on women's rights is partly a way to consolidate their power and control within their own ranks. It's a way to appease the most conservative elements of the movement and to project an image of strength and unwavering commitment to their ideology.
So it's as much about internal politics as it is about religious beliefs. That makes sense. But I'm also wondering about the long-term implications. Can the Taliban really hope to govern effectively and rebuild the country while alienating such a large portion of the population?
That's a key question. The Taliban are facing a major dilemma. They desperately need international recognition and financial assistance to rebuild Afghanistan's shattered economy. But their human rights record, especially their treatment of women, is a major obstacle to gaining that support.
It's a catch-22.
Yeah.
They need reform to get aid, but they're afraid of appearing weak or compromising their principles. So where does that leave them?
It's a difficult situation. Some experts believe that the Taliban might be willing to make some concessions on human rights, particularly if they see it as necessary for their own survival. But others are more skeptical, arguing that the Taliban's ideology is too deeply ingrained to allow for any real change.
So it's a waiting game to see how this plays out. But what about the role of other countries in all of this? We talked earlier about China and Pakistan's interests in Afghanistan. How might they influence the Taliban's decisions?
Well, both China and Pakistan have a vested interest in a stable Afghanistan, but their motivations are quite different. Pakistan sees Afghanistan as a strategic buffer against India and has long supported the Taliban. China, on the other hand, is primarily interested in accessing Afghanistan's mineral wealth and securing its regional influence.
So they both want stability, but they might have different ideas about what that looks like in practice.
Exactly. Pakistan might be willing to overlook the Taliban's human rights abuses as long as they maintain control and prevent Afghanistan from becoming a haven for anti-Pakistan militants. China, however, is more sensitive to international pressure and might push the Taliban to at least make some symbolic gestures towards reform in order to avoid jeopardizing their economic interests.
It's a complex geopolitical chess game with the Afghan people caught in the middle. But amidst all this talk of empires and power struggles, it's easy to forget that the future of Afghanistan ultimately depends on the Afghan people themselves.
That's a crucial point. Despite the challenges they face, Afghans are not simply passive victims. They have a long history of resilience and a deep desire for peace and a better future.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in the role of the younger generation. They've grown up in a very different Afghanistan than their parents, more connected to the world, more exposed to different ideas. What role might they play in shaping their country's future?
Yeah, you bring up a great point. We've talked a lot about these outside forces, but what about the internal dynamics, within Afghanistan? What gives you hope for the future, especially given all these challenges they face?
Despite the hardships and the restrictions, there are these glimmers of hope emerging from within Afghanistan, particularly from its younger generation. That's encouraging. I've read reports about these underground schools for girls, secret art collectives, and young entrepreneurs using technology to create opportunities. It seems like a whole generation is determined to resist the Taliban's attempts to, stifle their dreams and aspirations.
Absolutely. And this generation is tech-savvy and globally connected. They're using social media to organize, share information, and bypass censorship. They're finding these creative ways to keep the flame of hope alive, even in the darkest of times.
This reminds me of something we discussed earlier. The resource curse often leads to exploitation by foreign powers and this internal corruption. But couldn't this young, globally connected generation be the key to breaking that cycle?
That's a fascinating idea. Perhaps this generation, with its access to information and its understanding of how the world works, could be the catalyst for more responsible and equitable resource management in the future.
Imagine in Afghanistan, where its vast mineral wealth is used to benefit the Afghan people, to fund education, healthcare, and infrastructure development, rather than lining the pockets of corrupt officials or fueling foreign agendas. What a powerful vision.
It's a vision worth striving for, and one that resonates with many Afghans, especially the youth. They understand that their country has the potential to be a prosperous and thriving nation, not just a pawn in the games of empires.
So what can the international community do to support these positive developments? We talked earlier about shifting away from a purely geopolitical approach to one that prioritizes the needs and aspirations of the Afghan people. How do we translate that into concrete action?
It starts by listening to the voices of Afghans, particularly the younger generation. They're the ones who will inherit this country, and their perspectives are crucial. We need to support their efforts to build a better future, not by imposing our own solutions, but by providing resources and creating platforms for their voices to be heard.
That sounds like a much more sustainable and ethical approach than the top-down interventions of the past. What specific steps can we take in that direction?
We can start by supporting Afghan-led organizations and initiatives, particularly those focused on education, healthcare, and economic empowerment. We can also work to create opportunities for cultural exchange and dialogue, helping to bridge the gap between Afghanistan and the rest of the world.
And perhaps most importantly, we need to challenge the narratives that often paint Afghanistan as a hopeless case, a lost cause, because that kind of thinking only perpetuates the cycle of conflict and despair.
Absolutely. We need to amplify the stories of hope and resilience that are emerging from within Afghanistan, to showcase the incredible spirit of its people, and to remind the world that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can prevail.
Well said. I think this deep dive has been incredibly insightful. We've explored these complex historical forces that have shaped Afghanistan, the challenges and opportunities it faces today, and the glimmers of hope that are emerging from within.
And we've highlighted the importance of moving beyond a purely geopolitical approach to one that prioritizes the well-being and aspirations of the Afghan people.
As we wrap up, I want to leave our listener with a final thought. The future of Afghanistan is not predetermined. It's being shaped right now by the choices we make, both individually and collectively. Let's choose to support the Afghan people in their quest for peace, justice, and a brighter future.